All right. Hey, everyone. Can you hear me and see the screen here? Just going to double check. Sweet. All right. Well, thanks for the introduction, Isushi, and for having me. So I'm excited today to go over a few techniques for creating generative art in TouchDesigner, and specifically, we're going to be looking at ways of creating looping, like looping effects and looping generative art. So these are all different examples we're going to go over today. And so hopefully we have enough time to hit all five. I'll jump in pretty shortly, but I just want to give you guys an idea of what we're going to be doing. So all of these are locked to the timeline, which is a little, often in TouchDesigner, we're making real-time art, and all of this is real-time art generating in front of us, but we also want to sometimes, export things for something like Instagram or as a GIF. And so these are all instances where we can get looping content that would primarily be exported for the web. So as I'm going, if you do have questions, since I'm not able to sort of see you all in a room like a normal traditional workshop, if you do have questions, shoot them to the Q&A or the chat, but probably the Q&A will be the best for me to see. And if I do miss it, apologies if I'm kind of focused on going through these different examples. So the first two we'll look at are similar in the way that we put them together and the technique used. And hopefully you can apply this to other instances too. I'll be creating all of these from scratch as we go. So it gives you the whole process, but you do have these examples in the kind of example files. So you can kind of look back at them later. I might not create the exact same output. Oh, and one question about how I got involved with TouchDesigner. I can quickly answer that before I move on. I started kind of at school at University of Michigan studying art and technology, and I was interested in a lot of different kind of combinations of music and technology, specifically got into installation art, and after playing with a few different other tools, found TouchDesigner and really fell in love with how flexible it was for connecting to different sensors, creating kind of real-time visual content, connecting to audio applications. So that's really how I got started, and I've been using it for maybe 5 years now, 6 years almost. So yeah, that's how I got started. Yeah, and hopefully that gives you some idea. Happy to chat later, but I do want to dive in to some of these examples. So I'm actually going to create a new document. We'll look at these kinds of abstract terrain flyover. So you're dealing with kind of creating a landscape that you fly through. These are two slightly different approaches, but they use the same kind of technique to get the looping effect. So we'll look at that now. I'm going to go ahead and create, open up a new TouchDesigner document here. I'll keep this one open in case we want to reference it. Let's see, where's my TouchDesigners opening up? These all should work with your non-commercial licenses, but if you do encounter some issues with resolution, it should still function. So, all right, so here's our blank slate, or at least the starting operators. I'm going to go ahead and delete those. And this example uses a sphere that's rotating, so we're going to be looking at creating that first. And so I'm going to go ahead and create a sphere stop. One person asked if you can later upgrade an EDU version to commercial, which is true, you can do that. Okay, so we're creating a sphere stop, and I'm going to also, I need to move these videos, okay. So I'm going to go ahead and create after this, a transform. So what I kind of want to do is have this elongated sphere that we'll then displace with some noise to create our mountainous-like features. And so I'm going to go ahead and actually transform this in the, I think, or actually I can do this in the radius, actually just extending the kind of y-axis, and then I'm also going to rotate this in the z-axis so that we have this kind of like long egg. And what we'll do is we'll place the camera close to it so that we can get this, so it kind of looks like we're moving over like the Earth in a way. So you have this kind of spherical rotation. I'll also connect this to a geocomp. So what this lets us do, and this lets us kind of just immediately throw it into a comp for rendering. And then I'll also create a camera and a render. So this is a camera comp and a render top. So if you're not familiar with TouchDesigner, I'm going to be moving pretty quickly through some of this more introductory material, but you'll be able to watch this later just in the interest of time. But this is a very common sort of set of operators to render 3D geometry. And now I'm just setting up a way to see what we're doing throughout this process. So here's our rendered geometry, and creating a null. I'm going to set this as the display flag to see it in the background. And instead of working over this, up at the top, we can split our plane layout. So right up here, and I'll drag it to the left. I just want to be able to see my content to the right and not on the left. So I'll go to the top here, choose top viewer, this little drop down, and then right click on the left, display, and turn off backdrop top. So you can always see the output on the right as we go throughout the process from this null. The last thing I want to do on this sphere is in the detail tab under the parameters, which you can get to with P. I want more detail on this, so I'm going to add instead 800 by 800. If your computer kind of has trouble with this, feel free to knock this number down a little bit. You can also turn off the viewer, which will help save your CPU from trying to render these meshes, because it doesn't really need to do that. So that's one way to kind of speed things up, is toggling off your viewer. Okay, and we'll move the camera into position once we get kind of an idea of what this looks like, but for now I'll leave it zoomed out. All right, so really what we want now is we're going to use noise, a noise top, and this is going to be kind of like what we use to displace the height of that kind of terrain look. And we want to do something where it wraps around seamlessly, so that if we rotate this kind of like egg shape, it starts and stops at the same spot. However, by default, if we take this and plug it into a tile, you'll see that it doesn't seamlessly tile from top to bottom. So this is our technique that we're going to use to get kind of a seamless loop for our displacement map. And so in this case, I want to first set a couple things on the noise. Under the common page, I want to make sure that this is 16-bit. So this is going to give us a little bit better vertical resolution or depth to each pixel. Instead of 8 bits, 16 bits to represent. So that's a pretty significant jump in value. Also, we want to change the resolution here. So I'm going to start by setting this to 800 by 800, and I might change it later, but just to jump up a little bit, this will, and now I'm going to create a middle mouse click on this and choose a base. So this is what I'll use to actually blend the top with the bottom, so that we have kind of like a seamless tiling, at least in one direction. So I might call this blend edges, just to keep things organized. And now one thing I'm going to do, because we might reuse this in the next example, is I'll kind of make this more of a tool that we could potentially reuse. So I'll right click on this operator, this base, and one thing we can do is customize this component. So clicking this, I can create custom parameters that I can change from this top level. So I'll go ahead and create one called %, which will represent the % that we blend the top and the bottom. Clicking that, we'll see that now I have a first custom % parameter here, and I can close this now. I can always get back to it by customizing it. Now, double-clicking on this, jumping into it, this is where I'll do the actual blending. So what I want for this are 2 crop tops. So the first one is going to basically crop the first %. So if it's like, we'll set this to 0.75 up top. I'll go back inside, and we want to basically get that parameter. So one way we can do this, I'll be doing using Python expressions throughout. So these are really useful ways of getting information from an operator. And in this case, I'm going to use the parent function. So what I want, this first one is going to crop from the bottom to 75% of the image, or whatever I set that parameter to. So I can do type parent, then parentheses dot par for parameter, and then %. These are always capitalized when you create custom parameters, and you'll see that now it's grabbed that 0.75, so we can change it later by just adjusting the component, the parent component. So parent just grabs whatever component comp these are inside of. For the next one, we want to grab a crop from the 75% to 100%. So I'll just paste that same expression here, and now we've got our 2 sides. So the last thing I want to do is add a blend to one of these. So I'm going to use a ramp, and this needs to be set to vertical. And I'll set both of these stops to white. However, the first one, I will bring the alpha down. Sometimes it might mix this up, so let's see if I get it right. No, I did that backwards. I want to do the second one. So I'm looking at which of these edges need to line up, and it's this bottom edge. So now I will multiply these 2 together. You'll notice that right now it's changed in its kind of size and aspect to match input 2. So we want to make the first layer our fixed input. We also want to go to the common page and choose nearest pixel. This way we don't get any weirdness on the edge, which will cause kind of a weird hiccup when we actually tile it. And then the last thing we want to do is place this at the bottom of our original noise, so that the top and the bottom are identical. So to do this, I can use a over and make sure that I put the one on top that has the blending. So far, it's doing some weird things here. So first of all, we want to go to prefit overlay and choose native resolution. And also justify vertical bottom. And something weird is happening. So let me see. We are getting a little bit of a line here. So I wonder if I did. Maybe I need to change this also to nearest pixel. No. Let's see. What did I do? Interesting. So that will be an issue if we leave that. So I'll need to figure that out before we continue. So let's see what I might have done wrong. Let's see. Oh, okay. You're not getting the line? Yeah, I know. I haven't encountered it before. Okay, so other people are not getting the line. Let me just copy it from the existing one that I have over here, because I've done this 4 times today and I don't know what would be the problems. I'm just copying this from the existing one. We'll look at what's different, that we can see what maybe something is happening differently. It looks identical. So any case, if you're having trouble, take a look at the example. I might have made a small error. But in any case, we've got now sort of looping noise. So if we look at this tile, now we should see sort of from the top to bottom, you can see that we've got sort of a perfect loop. So this is going to be really useful for creating the displacement that wraps around our geometry. So kind of the next step here is we want to kind of like add that displacement to the actual geometry. So I'll create a null out of this, and let's see. I also want to, so this we can this can be our color map, and we'll color this better later, like with so it's not monochrome. And I'm going to also create a Fong, and we might as well create a light just so we can see what's happening. I'm actually going to do this in the up here. So okay, now we can see a little bit of shading. So we want a few different maps here for our material. Actually, first I'm going to drag that onto Geo1, and for the Fong, let's drop our color to the color map so we can kind of see what's happening. And we'll also grab, let's see, I'm going to copy this a few times. We're going to want a normal map, so I'm not doing a lot with that, and a height map. And for the normal map, I'll right-click here to add a normal map top. And so here we go. I'll drag the normal null onto normal map, and then enable the height map. So this is how we can use our height null information, dragging that onto height map, to then turn on displace vertices. So a few steps, but now we can see that this noise is displacing the vertices in the sphere that we've created. Now, a few things we need to do. One, I get this warning that there's a material normal mapping, but I don't have any tangent attributes. So this is a really easy fix. We just go to our, right after our transform, right click and add an attribute create, and then toggle tangents. And there we go. So that goes away. We also want to create some kind of valley that the camera can exist in. So we want to make sure that, yeah, that it can kind of not be like running into mountains, if you want to call these mountains. So one thing we could do is use a ramp for this. And I pulled it right out here. Oh, actually, I meant to, there's one step I missed out of the blend edges. I got distracted there. So I'm going to create a null and just do this first, just because I want this to be a square instead of this, because this process removes 75% of the height through this process. So I'm going to create a fit after this. Let's see what, yeah, here we go. And set this to 800 by 800, and also native resolution for the fit. You'll see that we're losing some kind of like the top and the bottom here. So I'm actually going to go back to my noise 1 and just divide this by the percent we're using. I could use an expression if you wanted to make this automatic, but we'll just kind of do this to get a resolution. So this should, let's see, divided by 0.75. I don't know. We are not seeing it fit, so that's interesting. Yeah, not working today. So I'll just, for now, oh, that's because I set this to 1,000. Okay, I'm going like, here we go. That makes a lot more sense. Okay, so 800 by 800, and now, you know, after it kind of crops the 75% from the top, we'll end up with something that's a little bit wider than 800, and then this fit will get it back into that 800 by 800. So cool. So now, okay. Yes, thanks. So for null 2, coming out of that, we've got our ramp. So I'm going to use this to create the valley of sorts. And so I'll create a stop in the middle, bring the value down to 0, and the outside's up to 1. So we will multiply by our height here. So I'm right-click and create a multiply. I'm going to have to rewire this a little bit. Here we go. And I might also, I just dragged this with my mouse. I didn't quite get it to 50%. So we can always just click this little drop down to access these keys for our ramp, which is useful if we want to say, I'm going to open the viewer here with A, or click the viewer active tab button and just type in 0.5 so that we get exactly in the middle. You'll also notice that so far it hasn't actually created the desired effect on the sphere. And to fix this, we can just take a transform. It's just not lining up with the axis that we want. So in this transform, coming out of the multiply, I'm going to go ahead and rotate it 90 degrees. And there we go. Okay, so we'll have to do some adjustments, but now you can see that black portion of the ramp kind of coincides with where we're going to put our camera. So I can go ahead and do that now. It's really just a matter of, this actually took a little time. I think tweaking cameras always takes a while. So it's not like I know these values work because I just know it. It took a little experimenting. So I found if we place this kind of at the 0.7 and then direct it down about 40 degrees, it kind of places it kind of in the appropriate location for where we want to fit it, set it. But this always takes a little bit of, it's a kind of a process to find the right spot. We also don't see a lot of let's add some color so we can see what's happening here, and then we'll also rotate it in a moment as well to get that kind of fly-through effect. So for the color, I'm a big fan of using lookup tables, lookup chops, lookup tops, essentially, and this lets us recolor this based on the value using a ramp. So I'll go ahead and create a ramp that we can use for our color, and also a lookup. And so far nothing has changed, but what this will do is it will remap the darkest to the lightest points of my image to like a long a gradient. And so I'll go here and start to add a little bit of color. Something is not happening here. I wonder if I moved it into a weird spot. Oh, I think my light is not in a good position, but we'll actually add, if we go to the Fong, sorry, I'm jumping around so much. If we go to the Fong, we can increase the constant amount, which should show us kind of a little bit more of the color. And the effect that I had, it didn't have a lot of fancy lighting, so it was mostly just kind of that process of the constant. Also, I noticed that we probably want to make sure that our multiply here is using the first input for the fixed layer, just because we want to keep that 16-bit float resolution, whereas I might as well even change this ramp. And I think I also have this as ease in, ease out, potentially. So, oh yeah, and actually, the last thing I didn't do on the camera, this is a big one, is go to the view and increase the field of view to 100 so we can actually see some of these mountains over here. I might even go to the Fong, back to the Fong, and just increase the display scale by maybe 1 point. You can play with it. This is like the middle mouse button gives me this value ladder. But you can play with that to get sort of more extreme mountains if you'd like. So I'm going to loop back to the ramp here and just finish adding a little bit more interesting color. We're so close to this middle section, really, like the camera's looking at this middle that I'm going to place these pretty close together. And you'll see that that roll off happens pretty fast because our geometry is so skewed, you know, that like egg shape. But through experimenting, I liked this effect. You can certainly play with it in different ways. So I won't spend too much time coloring this, but you can see how as I change this ramp, you know, I can kind of affect the color at the bottom or the top of the terrain that we're working with. Cool. And then kind of the last step here is to make everything rotate so that we have a loop according to our timeline at the bottom. So pretty much all of these examples we're looking at today are going to use the same trick using the timeline chop. So this gives us the current frame, but we can also turn on the end, which will tell us how long our current timeline is. So in this process, the length of the timeline will actually affect the speed of the animation. And what we'll do is we'll add a math after this, a math chop, and combine channels by dividing them. So this will give us a fraction. If I reset the min-max, you can see that now I've got basically a ramp based on my timeline. I'll also create a null after this and just call this ramp for reference. A lot of the examples, I'll have them colored just so you can easily see where it's located. Though we might only use this at one point in this example, this is basically what we're going to use throughout. So the last thing I want for this is I want to rotate my geometry essentially in this X direction. You can see now we're getting that effect when I just move middle mouse button and drag the value. So what we want this to do is from start to finish, move a full 360 degrees. So I'll add another math in here, and I'm going to range it from 0 to 1 to 0 to 360. So now we've got a full sweep, and I'll just click and drag. First, I open up the viewer and drag this onto my rotate, and I can use either an export or a chop reference. I'll just export it for now. And now here we go. So we've got ourselves that looping kind of flyover, and every 60 frames, we're sort of back to where we started because we have this tiling noise here. So, you know, the last few things you might want to, you know, play more with the colors. Something else we can add here would be like in my example, this was just a simple example that I put together for this workshop, but I would, you know, probably spend more on the post effects, and we'll look at some other examples throughout. But for now, we could just place this over a ramp to add some color in the background. So I'll grab a circular ramp, choose to hold the edges, and maybe increase the phase a little bit. And then, you know, you can choose a color that you like. This is all the design decision choices now, where you get to personalize it. Let's see, something like that. And here we go. So almost there. For the over, let's grab input 1 as the fixed layer. And certainly, you know, I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time tweaking the colors, but you can see here's like a slightly brighter version here. Also, you know, the first example we looked at, you know, also you can play with the quality of the noise to get kind of varying degrees of, you know, like if you want it to be denser, or just playing with the quality of what you feed in here will affect the you know, quality of the terrain that you're working with. So there's a lot you can do more in this. Actually, if you're interested, I have a tutorial on noise displacement that kind of dives into this a lot deeper, goes more into the normals and how you can get interesting lighting effects with that, which we're not going to cover today, but that's on my website if you're interested. So next, I want to just do another quick branch from this and show how we can use this to create a more linear fly through, where instead of moving around a spherical terrain, it's like a flat terrain, but still displaced. And so that example is right here. And in this case, we could use the same technique to do this, where we displace a grid. It's pretty much the same idea. However, this one uses instancing and draws, 1,000 or so or more tiny cubes, which I think is an interesting effect. So we'll go ahead and create that. I'm going to go back here, and we're going to keep our blend edges tool just because we're going to reuse that. And I also will maybe keep this timeline and the math after it. But everything else, I'm going to just wipe out. You can save it. I just have it saved already. So let's go ahead and just delete all of this. And I guess, were there any questions on what I just had here, actually, before I move on? Okay, I don't see any, so great, perfect. So I'll go ahead and delete this, and let's go ahead and create this second terrain flyover example. So in this case, the previous one used displacement, but we are going to use tops to instance geometry in this case. And so I want this noise that I'm creating here to end up ultimately being used for the height of these. And I want a little more control over the size of my grid, because that will determine how many rectangles I'm drawing, and also depending on the computer you're using, or the whether you might not be able to use as many. So let's create a constant chop, and this I'll use to define sort of the resolution or the rows and columns throughout the whole kind of project. So if I ever want to change these, I can come back to this, and I'll call this pairs, or PARS, for parameters. There's a lot of different ways to store parameters, but this is just a quick one. And I'll type rows and columns, or calls. And for this example, I'm going to use 250 by 600. Though if you encounter any issues, you can always drop these numbers down, and that will improve performance. So I'm going to use these values to determine my resolution. One quick way to do this is opening the viewer and dragging and dropping onto the resolution. And I'm going to use chop references for this so that it'll automatically grab the Python expression that grabs the rows channel and the calls channel. And let's see, I'm going to place a null afterwards. Now you'll notice that this is much smaller than the original, so we're going to need to do some things to make sure that this output is the right size. I'm going to change the percent to 0.5 in this case, and then the original noise, I'm going to multiply the height by 2. Again, we could link those two with an expression if you wanted more flexibility here. For now, I'm just going to hard code this. But now you'll see that my output here, 250 by 600, lines up. So that's kind of what we're going for. And after that, let's see, where am I at? And this is already a 16-bit float, perfect. So, and we also have we need that timeline. Okay, here it is. So the next step, instead of rotating geometry, which we did in the last example, I want to actually keep move the ground kind of under you. And then I can do this just by moving the kind of translating or the noise here. So I'm going to use a transform, and using this same ramp here. Actually, I'll delete our old math. We don't need that anymore. I'm going to create a new null for my ramp just so it doesn't have the export already set. Color this red again. Maybe color my parameters something too. So this is pretty straightforward, but we can take our ramp I'm going to use a chop reference for this, and we want to translate it in the Y direction. So I'll go ahead and drag this on top and use a chop reference. So you'll see that we're now floating away. We have this transparent section. So let's go to the tile section and choose repeat. So great, we have this seamless, moving noise that is locked to our timeline again. So this is what we're going to use for like our mountains, and it's not, the actual instances are not going to move. In this case, they're just going to move up and down and stay static, but it will actually create, if you look at the original here, it does feel like we're moving forward, even though each of those boxes is just moving up and down, which is kind of interesting. If you move it slow enough, you'll actually notice, but in this case, this is perfect. So we're going to want to use this for the height. And so one thing that this is the only GLSO I'm going to use, and there's other ways to do this, but essentially what I want to do is generate a UV so that I've got basically 0 to 1 on the x-axis and 0 to 1 on the y-axis, but in pixel values. And GLSL is just a very quick way to do that. We could also use ramps, and actually Polyhop 12 has a lot of examples of this if you're interested in like non-GLSL ways of creating what is essentially a grid, but in pixel values. But we're just going to dive in here. This is actually really not going to be too tricky. So even if you haven't done any GLSL, there's not a lot happening here. So we're going to go in here and uncomment our vec4 color, which is really storing the input of this transform. It's giving me an error because I have 2 of those declared. But I'm actually going to change this to a float called, I'll just use n as like an arbitrary letter. And because I just want to sample the, one channel. This is like monochrome. And I also need to, this is right now, this texture function is giving me the entire red, green, blue, and alpha, and I only want one of those channels, so I can type .r, which will only give me that first red channel. And then for the color, this vec4, which is essentially storing red, green, blue, and alpha values, I'm going to use my UV coordinates, which are giving me normalized coordinates from 0 to 1 on both axes, and I'll type vuv.s and vuv.t, and for my blue values will be the height. This basically is creating XYZ positions, and then 1 for alpha, just so I can see what's going on. I won't be using that channel, but lastly, I'm going to position this so that they're centered at 0. So I'll subtract 0.5 and 0.5. I can copy this into the chat too if it's helpful. Let's see. Okay, so great. Looks like it's working. And actually, it's a little hard to see what's happening, especially in the bottom. But if we open the viewer and hit N, this is the normalized view. And we can see also the ranges. So our red values are going from about negative 0.5 to 0.5, again for our green values, and then we've got our blue values moving upward. So this is basically a way of just packaging easily all of the kind of position data. I'll go ahead and copy this in case anyone gets any typos or anything. There we go. So moving forward, this is our position data. And so each one of these pixels is going to be 1 cube, and the RGB values represent the XYZ position. So a really amazing way of sort of dealing with instances, different than some of the other examples we'll look at today. So great. The next step is we want to actually instance these. So I'm going to go ahead and create I'm going to use boxes for this, a box SOP. And it's going to be a little bit too large as it is. So actually, I'm going to go to my parameter constant and add, I'll just call this scale, and I'll set this to 0.015. So these are going to be pretty small, but we'll be able to adjust this if we want to make it larger later. And I'll just go ahead and drag that right onto my box's scale, the chop reference. So now I have a tiny box here. And I'll plug this into a geo comp, which is where I will be doing my instancing. So there's this instance tab on more recent, like as of, I don't know, the last year or so, we've been able to instance directly from Tops, which has been a really powerful tool. So that's what we're going to be doing in this example. I'll turn on the instancing, drag my position as the default instance operator, and you click this caret, you can see I have red, green, blue, and alpha, so I don't get to really name them, but I can just type RGB, and actually we're not getting anything over here because I don't have a camera, but you can actually see, if we zoom in here, that we've got our terrain sort of shape. So that's great. So the next step, I should set up our render network so we can see what's happening. So we can go ahead and create a new camera, a new render top, and I'll go ahead and make this 1080. You can set, whatever resolution you'd like, but that's what I'm going to be using here to make it easy to fit. A null, and toggle the display so we can see what's happening. So great, we've got a chunk of boxes here. We can also position the camera. So to do this is actually something I didn't use in the last example, but I use quite a bit, are null comps. And I will drag this onto the camera and choose the look at parameter so that my camera is looking at this point in space, which is essentially what this null represents, which is very handy because I also know that that point in space is the location 0, 0, 0 of my terrain. So if I want to move a camera around something, I can have it look at that location. And so in this case, let's bring the camera in a little bit. And we're still not seeing it very well because, again, we don't have any color. So I'll come back to adjust this later. But one thing I know that I'm going to want, again, similar to the last example, is a kind of valley for the camera to move through so it doesn't get hit by any of these mountains. So I'm going to use the same technique. I could have even left this there, but we'll do it again. And in this case, let's see, we want black stop in the middle for our valley. And I might make these a little bit closer. So we've got adjacent like hills, and then so that we don't see the edges of these hills, I'll make them taper on the left and the right. So this is the left, middle, furthest right are going to be closer to 0. Again, if you want to be really precise, you can go in and change this to, actually it's pretty close, but 0.25, especially if you're not having trouble aligning these exactly. These keys are useful for, they basically define the position and the values of each of these stops. So really useful to know that that's there. Cool. I'll also make sure that this is set to a 16-bit pixel format. And then I'll go ahead and multiply by that ramp. Okay, cool. So I might also set this to ease in, ease out, just to get, you can kind of notice, even though it's black and white, there's like a sharp dip here. So we might want to just smooth these curves out a little bit. Yeah, sweet. So I guess the next few things we want to do, now that we've got our boxes showing up, we'll adjust the camera in a moment, but I want to add some color so we can kind of see the detail here a little bit better. What I did in the previous example was take our noise actually coming out of this ramp here. We don't need our kind of like grid necessarily because we just want to map color to each of these points. So I'm going to middle mouse click so I make a branch and add a noise. Actually, I don't want that first operator. I want the second one here. So this, I need to adjust the size, but essentially we're using the first to remap the noise, which gives you this basically like interesting contoured shape. And again, I'm going to want to use these rows and columns to set my resolution for my noise. So I'll drag these over, chop reference, and then the columns also chop reference, so that now this matches the same size. If you don't match the size of this, you're not gonna, it'll break, it won't work. So you wanna make sure that these are always the same resolution. So I'll create a null here, and actually, yeah, we'll go ahead and add this to our instance page. I'll call this color, drop it in, and type RGB. Nothing will happen yet because we do not have a material. You'll see it here, but we need to go ahead and add, I'm going to use a constant. So, okay, there we go. It needs a little bit of work, but we've got ourselves our mountains. So let's go ahead and get our camera into position. I think we're going to want to move it down a lot closer. Here we go. Another thing you're going to notice, and maybe you should wait to do this, is that these boxes all overlap one another, and you know, this is a square, even though our noise input is a kind of like large, like elongated rectangle. So we need to do a little bit more to our position to make sure that our boxes kind of fit next to one another. So to do this, I'm going to create a math after the GLSO, because if you recall, our x and y values are basically going from -0.5 to 0.5. So we want to like basically set this based on the scale and the rows and columns. So what I'm going to do is for rearrange both of these in the range section. We've got our from range R and from range G, which we can set separately. So I'll go ahead and drag, you know, we're going to go from 0 to 1, and I'll drag my rows here, use a chop reference. You can see it already changed pretty dramatically. And then I'm going to multiply the rows by my scale. So let's see if I do this right. Actually, I'm going to want to copy this, multiply this by scale. Cool, okay, and then so now it's a little bit hard to see, but if I pause it, you can see that the rows here are at least lined up. We still have some space in the columns. So we'll need to do that same operation. Oh, I pasted that in the wrong spot, that's why. There we go, okay, that makes more sense. So, so this is our rows, and then the next one, G, is going to be our columns. Let's just copy and paste, and then calls. Okay, so this is looking better, and more like what we had, where the spacing is basically linked to the scale. And if we did go here and change this, you can see how, I mean, we're still getting vertical spacing where the height isn't quite high enough. We could actually, I didn't do this in my original, but we changed the height of these boxes, we could actually avoid that issue. So I changed that so that the boxes are all much higher, and now we're, you know, we'll get that coverage. I don't know why I didn't think about that until now, but there's that solution. So if we do get some sort of vertical displacement that's beyond the amount, the height of the box, we can, we're not going to see through the mountain, if you will. So anyway, we'll keep this at 0.015, but you can play with it as you'd like. Now, we're still in a monochrome world, so let's go ahead and play with some of this here. So I'll go ahead and, again, use a lookup top. So this is like go-to coloring tool right here, and choose a ramp, plug that right in. And now I can, again, define some colors throughout. Let's see, here you can kind of get more extreme if you'd like, because the noise is giving us this interesting banding. And again, playing with this noise here will give us, different like intensity. On pause. Okay, here we go. So now it's moving. Yeah, you can actually see it move. So yeah, playing with this will give us sort of different range of effects. Also, you'll notice that it like always is yellow in this basin right now. So one thing we can do to fix that is, instead of multiplying it completely by 0 on our ramp, if we make that middle stop a slightly higher value, then we'll get a little bit of that noise still. It won't just be 0. So here, let's add another color, a little blue. Cool. Sure. And then again, like if you don't like exactly what it looks like, even changing the seed will start to give you, different looks. So let's see, what else we needed to do? Maybe adjust this a little bit now that we've changed our, let's see, here we go. So we're actually pretty, I think there's a lot of, like the position of the camera, there's a lot more terrain. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. A lot more terrain that can be seen if we move backwards more. Okay, what's going on here? It's a little bit sometimes tricky to, am I doing the right one? Sometimes hard to get this exactly right, but this is looking a little bit better. Yeah, -2. And so we're getting more of that kind of like landscape feel. It's actually moving backwards though, which is I'm realizing right now. So this is something we can do at the ramp level, where we can say, okay, instead of going from 0 to 1, let's just go from 1 to 0. And okay, now we're moving forwards. Now there's a couple pieces of kind of like post effects that we can add to this. For instance, the mountains just pop into the distance. So we might want those to fade in, so it's almost like there's fog. We can do this on our color, actually, by multiplying this lookup by, or my color by another ramp. So I'll go ahead and create one. And I'll set this to my same parameters for the height and the width. So just copying and pasting that. Rows, calls. I'll make this a vertical ramp. And I basically want it to be completely white, except that at the end, where the beginning of the landscape is coming in, let's just bring that last stop's alpha down and multiply those two. So you might not see a lot yet, and that's because we haven't actually set in our instances the alpha channel. So I'll type A, and now you can see it fading in the background. A couple other things we can do here. So if you look at my example, there's like a background and some depth of field type effect. So to do that, first, let's create kind of more of a background here. So I'm going to use ramps to do this again. The example I had there, we sort of multiply, so it gets a little bit darker at the base, but it all depends on kind of like what you're going for. You can play with what's in the background quite a bit here. The second one I'll make, let's see, make this circular, holding the left and the right again. And let's see, didn't spend a lot of time on the color for this one. So, but that's something that, one can tweak kind of indefinitely. Okay, so what do we want here? Maybe, I don't know to look good yet. So for now, maybe I'll just set this over. So we have a background. Now you can kind of see the fade a little bit better. Definitely not matching my color scheme. Yeah, blue, that's a little bit better. And then one other thing that I had on my example, and this is something you can find in the palette. So if you haven't checked these out, there's a lot of like really great tools that are just kind of like drag and drop from the image filters. So Bloom is a handy one, just to like add a little bit of something special. You'll see that if I add it right away, it's like way too much, too overpowering. So I'll have to go in, really bring down the intensity quite a bit, and the threshold can be tweaked as well. Maybe even like 0.04. No, I'll use the value ladder. And again, like you'll need to change things like the glow color, and even these ramp parameters to really kind of get a feel for this. It takes a bit of getting used to, but I find that it can really add just like a little bit of like glow in different areas where there's brighter parts of the image. And then the last thing we might do, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on tweaking the bloom parameters, but it's something you can play with, is getting that kind of blur in the background. So this is something, yeah, I will be taking a break after this sketch, by the way. So we're running a little bit over, but Yasushi just mentioned that. So just so you know. So this last one, actually, I think Yasushi let Derivative know, but we found an issue with this Luma blur in the Mac version. So it might not work for you if you're on a Mac, but we're going to use this in a second. But in any case, we're going to grab the depth top. So you just want to create this and then drag your render on top. So what this is going to do is gives us a value based on how far away the objects are in our scene, which is really useful for something like Luma Blur, which can blur things based on the luminosity of the input. So we'll see how that works in just a second. I'm going to go ahead and choose 16-bit float, and then for depth space, rearrange from camera space, just so that I can get a little more control. And I'll rearrange from, say, 8. Add clouds in the sky, probably, yes, that, we could look at that. Yeah, rearranging from, say, 1 to 8, or 1 to 7. I don't know, you can kind of play with this until we start seeing things kind of fade completely in the background. So now we've got things fading in. And if I plug, coming out of my bloom, I'll plug that into the Luma blur. And then, yeah, noise top would be a good way to do clouds for sure. Plug this into the depth. And then let's add a little bit more blur here. So you can really tweak this however much you'd like. Like this is a pretty extreme look. Maybe it would be better for the compression. Oh yeah, nice. And there's a way you can do it with also just you know, multiplying this by a blurred version and comping it on top. So that's another way. But you should check out Yasushi's example as well. But yeah, you can see that it has a nice like depth effect, and I'm going to leave it extreme so that you can see it through the compression on zoom. But yeah, essentially that those are a few different kind of effects we can add. I think the last one that I have in my example, which is again a very optional one, but one I like to sort of use sparingly, is the screen space ambient occlusion. So, you know, note that like this will actually hit my laptop really hard if I'm not careful. So it's not made for every machine, but we'll need to change some parameters before it looks good. But on this machine, I'll crank up the directions in the sample steps, bring down the surface angle. This kind of adds some occlusion based on the just like geometry on the screen. I'll choose the full resolution here and really make this a small radius, because we have actually pretty small geometry here, and I just want the edges. And then I'm also going to decrease the blur. We even need a little bit more sample direction. It's a little bit crunchy. And also bring down the contrast. But what you can kind of see is this, it actually shows, gives you a little bit more definition of the cube. So if I toggle this off, we don't have quite as much texture. So this one, definitely hitting several, like 5 milliseconds on my GPU if I middle mouse, which is not great. So, it's something that you can kind of add, but you'll also see it hits my FPS. And if you're on a laptop or a computer that doesn't have a heavy graphics card or CPU, then you could see this hit pretty hard, and your frames per second would drop. So, but it is nice if you want to add it. So that's yeah. So that's this example, and you can look at what we did here, but also compare it to the example in the example files. So we're going to take a break, and when we come back, we'll look at a couple more examples, and then hopefully have time for this last one at the end. So yeah, if you do have any additional questions, feel free to send those my way as well. Thanks.